They took everything from me except the one thing they never knew existed. My daughter forced me into a memory care facility on a Tuesday morning in late October. She had papers. She had a doctor's signature. She even had a social worker standing in my living room in Oakville, Ontario. Holding a clipboard like this was all perfectly routine. My son-in-law stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed. And my daughter, my only child, the girl I coached through every hockey practice and every heartbreak, stood by the front door and would not look at me. "Dad, it's for your own good," she said. I was 67 years old. I had run my own accounting practice for 31 years. I had never once forgotten a name, a fatse, a tax filing date, or a birthday. But here she was, telling the social worker that I had been leaving the stove on, wandering the neighborhood at night, forgetting to eat. None of it was true. Every single word was a lie she had rehearsed. I want you to understand what was really happening. Because this story is not about a confused old man who needed help. This is about a house on Lakeshore Road worth $1 million. A daughter who had racked up close to $400,000 in personal debt. And a son-in-law who had convinced her that the fastest solution was to have me declared mentally unfit. My name is Gerald. And what they did not know, what no one in that room knew except me, was that 14 years earlier, I had placed a document inside a fireproof box, sealed it, and left it with a person they had never met and would never think to look for. I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for exactly this moment. My wife Margaret passed away 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer. We had 38 years together in that house. We raised our daughter Claire there, planted the garden in the backyard together, refinished the hardwood floors ourselves. One summer when Claire was at camp, after Margaret died, Claire called every Sunday. She came for Christmas and Thanksgiving. She seemed to genuinely care. I thought I was lucky. Her husband, my son-in-law, was a different matter. He had always been pleasant enough on the surface, the kind of man who laughs loudly at his own jokes and picks up the dinner check with great ceremony. But there was something underneath that I had never been able to name. A watchfulness. A way of scanning the room that had nothing to do with enjoying it. He sold commercial real estate, and he was good at it. Which meant he understood the value of property, the way other men understand the value of oxygen instinctively. Constantly. Without ever turning it off. After Margaret died, he started coming to Sunday dinners. He started asking questions. Casual questions. The kind that don't sound like anything until you write them all down together. What had I paid for the house originally? Had I ever thought about a reverse mortgage? Did I know what comparable properties on the street had sold for? Was the estate fully settled? Did I have a financial advisor? I answered carefully and changed the subject. I had been an accountant for 3 decades. I knew what those questions meant. About 2 years ago, Claire started coming alone on Sundays. She looked tired. She looked the way Margaret had looked in the months before. She told me about the diagnosis, that specific kind of tired that comes from carrying something you have not yet said out loud. I asked her twice if everything was all right. Both times she said yes. The third time I asked, she started crying at my kitchen table and told me that they were in serious financial trouble. I will not go into every detail of what they had done because it is not relevant, and also because even now, even after everything, she is still my daughter. What I will say is that between a failed investment property in Mississauga, 2 lines of credit they had maxed out, and my son-in-law's habit of living about 40% beyond what he actually earned, they were in a position that was not recoverable without a significant influx of cash. He felt for her. Of course I did. I offered to lend them money, a real loan, with paperwork, as much as I could comfortably manage. She said they needed more than that. I asked how much more. She named a figure that was essentially the equity in my house. I said I was sorry, but that was not something I was able to do. That house was my retirement. That house was Margaret's and mine. I was not going to sign it away. She stopped calling on Sundays after that. For several months, I barely heard from her. Then in the spring, she started coming around again. And she was warm and attentive in a way that felt slightly off, slightly too consistent, too deliberate. She brought groceries I had not asked for. She reorganized my kitchen. She mentioned, twice, that the house was too big for one person. She suggested I might be happier in a condo. I thanked her and did not engage. Then the story started. She told my doctor, my own doctor, who I had seen for 20 years, that she was concerned about my cognitive health. She told him I had been confused on the phone, that I had repeated myself, that I had called her by her mother's name. I found this out later. At the time, my doctor scheduled what he framed as a routine wellness check and asked me a series of questions that I later recognized as a standard cognitive screening. I answered all of them correctly, because there was nothing wrong with me. But that screening went into my file, and that file, my son-in-law later told the social worker, showed early signs of concern. The morning they came to take me to the facility, I had been up since 5. I had made coffee. I had read the Globe and Mail. I had called my neighbor Tom to ask if he wanted a ride to our Thursday curling match. When the doorbell rang at 8:30 and I opened the door to find my daughter, my son-in-law, a social worker, and a man I did not recognize who turned out to be a private care coordinator, I understood immediately what was happening, not because I was confused, because I had been expecting something like this for months. The social worker was a young woman named Andrea, who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. She explained that a concerned family member had initiated a wellness assessment, and that, given the documentation provided, a temporary placement had been arranged at a care facility in Burlington while a more thorough evaluation could be conducted. She used the word temporary 3 times. People use words like that when they know the situation is not what the word suggests. My son-in-law stood by the fireplace and said nothing. My daughter stood by the door and would not look at me. I asked if I had any legal recourse to refuse. Andrea hesitated. My son-in-law stepped forward and said that given the documentation, it was strongly advised that I cooperate, and that any resistance would only support the family's concerns about my state of mind. It was actually a well-constructed trap. I will give him that. I asked if I could have 10 minutes to pack a bag. Andrea said, "Of course." My daughter started to follow me upstairs. I told her, calmly, that I would prefer to do it alone, and that I would be back down in 10 minutes. Something in my voice, the complete absence of panic, I think made her stop at the foot of the stairs. I packed a small bag, clothes, toiletries, my reading glasses, a book, and then I sat on the edge of my bed for 3 minutes and thought about the document. 14 years ago, when Margaret was first diagnosed, and we were sitting in an oncologist's office on a Tuesday afternoon, trying to absorb information that felt completely unreal, I became suddenly and intensely aware of how quickly a life could be disrupted, not just by illness, by anything, by circumstances you had not anticipated and could not control. In the weeks that followed, while Margaret was beginning treatment and we were both learning how to live inside uncertainty, I did something that I did not fully explain to her at the time because I did not want to frighten her. I drew up a secondary will, not a replacement for my existing will. In addition to it, a specific, legally separate document that addressed the disposition of the Oakville property independent of everything else. I had it drafted by a lawyer named Robert Oze, who worked out of an office in Hamilton and who had no connection to my regular legal affairs and no relationship with my family. I signed it. Robert witnessed it, and then I left the original copy with Robert, placed a duplicate in a fireproof box in my storage unit in Burlington, a unit rented under my middle name, which is not a name anyone in my family uses for me or has ever thought to look for, and I told no one. Note, Margaret. Not my accountant. Not my neighbor Tom. No one. The document stated clearly that in the event of my death or cognitive incapacitation, the property at my address on Lakeshore Road was to be transferred directly to a charitable land trust, specifically a community housing organization that Margaret had donated to for years. My daughter would receive the contents of my registered accounts and my non-real estate assets, which were substantial enough to clear her debts twice over if managed carefully, but the house would not go to her. The house would go to people who needed housing. This was not cruelty. This was clarity. I had watched my son-in-law look at my house for years, the way a person looks at something they have already decided belongs to them. I had seen my daughter slowly become someone I did not recognize under the weight of his ambitions and his debts. I did not want that house to be the thing that completed her transformation. I went back downstairs with my bag. My son-in-law was standing in the front hall looking at the bookshelves in a way that made my jaw tighten. My daughter was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking quietly. Andrea was waiting near the door. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I walked out of my own front door and got into the car they had arranged. And I said nothing. And I let them think they had won. The facility in Burlington was called Maple Ridge Retirement and Care. It was not unpleasant. The staff were kind. The food was adequate. There was a common room with large windows that looked out onto a garden that had gone brown for the season, and an activities coordinator who organized afternoon card games that I attended because there was nothing else to do, and because the other residents were interesting people who had clearly been deposited there by circumstances beyond their control. Just as I had, I was placed in a private room. My daughter had apparently paid for the private room, which I noted was easier to afford when you expected to shortly acquire a $1 million property. I had my book. I had my reading glasses. I had my phone, which they had not thought to take. On the second morning, I called Robert Oze. He answered on the third ring. I had not spoken to him in over a decade. I told him my name. He said he remembered it very clearly. I told him what had happened. There was a long pause, and then he said, "Gerald, I think we need to move quickly." And I said, "I agree completely." And we spent the next 45 minutes on the phone making arrangements. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic in the way television has trained us to expect drama. It was paperwork and phone calls and meetings and a legal process that moved with its own slow, grinding momentum. Robert contacted my existing lawyer, who had not known about the secondary document, but who, once presented with it, was able to confirm its validity. A geriatric psychiatrist, a real one, retained by Robert, not arranged by my son-in-law, came to Maple Ridge and conducted a full assessment. His report, which I have read and which I will not quote here because the language is dense and technical, concluded in plain terms that I was cognitively intact and that the original placement had been based on documentation that was, at minimum, significantly misleading. The social worker, Andrea, to her credit, cooperated fully when the inquiry began. She told investigators that she had felt uneasy about the case from the start, and that the family had applied significant pressure. She was not in trouble. She had done her job as she understood it. The pressure had come from above her. My son-in-law retained a lawyer. My daughter retained a separate one. For a brief period, it seemed like this might become a long and ugly legal proceeding, the kind that leaves everyone damaged. Then the secondary will was formally registered. I was told about the moment my daughter's lawyer read the document because Robert was in the room. He said she went completely still, not upset, not angry still, like someone who has been running hard in a direction and has suddenly understood that the direction was wrong from the beginning. She called me that evening. I was sitting in the common room at Maple Ridge, watching the news with a man named Frank who had been a civil engineer and who had opinions about infrastructure that I found genuinely interesting. When my phone rang and I saw my daughter's name, Frank tactfully moved to the other side of the room. She did not apologize right away. She started to explain, and then she stopped explaining. And then she said, "Dad, I don't know what happened to me." I said, "I think I do." We talked for a long time. I am not going to tell you that conversation resolved everything, because it did not. I am not going to tell you that I forgave her completely in that phone call, because I did not. What I will tell you is that I heard something in her voice that I had not heard in almost 2 years. Something that sounded like the person she had been before. She had made herself into someone else for the sake of a man who saw my house as a solution to his problems. Her marriage did not survive the legal proceedings. That was not something I caused or wished for. It was simply the weight of everything they had done, collapsing under itself. I was discharged from Maple Ridge in late November. Robert drove me home himself. When we pulled into the driveway on Lakeshore Road, the maple tree in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves and the garden had gone to frost. The house looked exactly as it had always looked: solid, quiet, familiar. I made tea. I called my neighbor Tom, who had been furious on my behalf since the beginning, and who had already looked into whether there were grounds for elder abuse charges under Ontario law. There were. As it turned out, my son-in-law eventually agreed to a settlement that covered my legal costs and a portion of the distress damages in exchange for no criminal filing. I agreed to this not because I felt it was sufficient, but because I wanted it finished. I wanted the whole thing finished so I could go back to my life. The house, when I die, will go to the Community Housing Trust. My daughter knows this now. She has told me she understands. I believe she does. Though understanding something and being at peace with it are different things. And I think she is still working on the second part. She came for Christmas. We sat at the kitchen table where she used to cry when she was 7 and couldn't understand her math homework. And we ate the lamb stew I had been making since before she was born. She did not bring her husband. She looked tired in a different way than before, the tired of someone setting something down, rather than the tired of someone carrying it. I have been asked, by people who know the story, why I made that document so long ago. Why I anticipated something so extreme. Why I hid it, even from Margaret. Here is what I tell them. I was an accountant for 31 years. I spent my professional life looking at the gap between what people intended and what actually happened. Between the plan and the reality. Between the story people told themselves about their finances and the numbers on the page. I am not cynical. I do not think most people are malicious. But I do think that money, the prospect of it, the need for it, the smell of it changes people in ways they do not see coming and would not choose if they could. I did not make that document because I knew my daughter would one day try to take my house. I made it because I knew that I could not know what the future held, and that the people I loved were not exempt from the forces that change people. Margaret would have understood this. She understood most things about me, usually before I understood them myself. Sometimes, sitting by the window in the late afternoon when the light comes through the way it does in November, flat and golden and very still. I think she probably knew about the document anyway. Knew I had done something practical and quiet to protect what we had built. She would not have asked about it. She would have trusted that I had thought it through. She would have been right. To anyone watching this who is older and who has felt the ground shifting under them, who has seen the way people you love begin to look at your home or your accounts or your assets differently than they once did, I want to say this clearly. Your experience and your history and your rights do not diminish because you are aging. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find a lawyer who is yours alone, not connected to your family, and keep one card that no one knows you're holding, not out of suspicion, out of wisdom. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having moved through it and arrived at the other side with your integrity intact. I sit in my house on Lakeshore Road and I drink my coffee, and I watch the ice form on the lake in January. And I feel that peace. Some mornings I feel it so strongly that I put my hand on the kitchen counter, the same counter Margaret chose at a tile showroom in 1987, and I am simply grateful for the house, for the years, for the fact that I was, when it mattered, the kind of man who had planned ahead. If you are in a situation like mine, please do not wait. And if you know someone who is, please share this story with them, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can have is something no one else knows is there.